Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about the difference between direct gas impingement and external gas piston operating systems in the AR-15 platform. Now, in order to talk about this, we are going to need to go ahead and cover some caveats, make sure that we properly understand what my thesis statement and purpose here is, and then also define some terms. Now, first off, for the caveats. During this discussion, I'm going to refer to the most common AR-15 operating system as the direct gas impingement system. Now, in recent times, it has been discovered or changed to be that you refer to that term as internal gas piston versus external gas piston. To me, that, as much as I understand the principle and theory behind it and don't necessarily disagree with it, it has always struck me as being a little... It kind of smacks of splitting hairs. In addition to that, whenever you're having a discussion about the two platforms pretty much in the same conversation, it's actually a little bit easier to follow the conversation if you refer to them with two very different terms. So because of that, I will be referring to internal gas piston as direct gas impingement and external gas piston as external gas piston. Just to make it easier to actually follow the overall conversation it is that we're having. A little bit more. And you know what? Shh. Maybe just a tad more Havana Club. All right, cool. So that's my purpose. Words have meaning, and in this case, if I change up the words just a little bit to where they're not 100% right, but they're still technically right, it'll make it a little bit easier to follow the conversation that we are having. So now let's go ahead and talk about my purpose here today. Well, my purpose is not to tell you that one of these systems is necessarily better than the other. What I'm here to tell you today is the difference between those systems and why you might choose one as opposed to the other. Excellent. So, I will voice my opinions and my own experiences on the matter. However, that is not to say that one is necessarily better than the other or you're wrong for choosing one or the other. I just want you to understand so that you can make decisions, good, informed decisions between the two. Now, let's go ahead and define some terms. I'm going to use my own words for this instead of read it out of Webster's or something like that. Direct gas impingement is a semi-automatic action which originated with the AR-15, in which gas is tapped off by a hole in the barrel, very common in semi-automatic actions. That gas is then routed down a gas tube that runs above the barrel all the way back to the receiver. It gets injected into the bolt carrier group via the gas key located on top and gets driven to the rear of the rifle, compressing the buffer spring, causing functioning to occur. Now, external gas piston really isn't that different. It does have a hole in the top of the barrel that vents gas upwards into a chamber where it is pressed against a operating rod which extends all the way to the receiver and strikes the bolt carrier group, running it back against the buffer spring, causing functioning to occur. So, in a direct gas impingement system, we have a gas tube over top of the barrel, and an external gas piston, we have a piston rod located on top of the barrel. Kind of like an AK-47, but an AK is more indicative of long stroke gas piston, whereas in an AR-15 we more commonly see short stroke gas piston. Alright, so the original M16, as designed by Eugene Stoner, used a direct gas impingement system. And there were a lot of issues with the early M16, not very much so attributed to direct gas impingement, but direct gas impingement didn't necessarily help the situation out. There's actually a lot of things that contributed to the early problems that soldiers faced with the M16 in Vietnam, and Colt realized that the customer at that point might start asking for an external gas piston system on the same operating platform. So they actually, in the 70s, designed an external gas piston M16. However, the request never came down. The issues with the M16 were identified and corrected in other ways that didn't require an entirely different upper. But as it would turn out, Colt would keep that kind of in the back of their minds. They'd put it on a shelf for a little while, up until SOCOM decided that they wanted to have a rifle that conformed to their own requirements, a technical data package that they had specific control of instead of having to go through the Army in order to be able to get any changes to their own rifles. You can see where that would be very enticing to an organization. So they put out a requirement for a new set of trials called the SCAR program. And Colt and a whole bunch of other manufacturers introduced external gas piston systems for it because the requirements that were put out by SOCOM pretty much were asking for external gas piston without asking for external gas piston. It would have been a lot shorter for them to have just said, we want an external gas piston system. Apparently that's not what they actually did. Now, Colt would also supply an direct gas impingement system in order to try to kind of entice SOCOM in that direction away from external gas piston, but they were pretty dead set on it. From what I understand, both of Colt's submissions actually performed very well in the trials, but Colt wound up awarding the contract to FN for their FN16 and FN17S, which are the 5.56 and 7.62 SCAR rifles as we know them today. Now, this kind of starts the whole argument rolling for external gas piston over direct gas impingement. And this would actually pick up speed over the years, especially after the, say, sunset of the assault weapons ban, when AR-15s really leap forward in popularity, and there's more and more manufacturers coming out there, and there's more and more people trying to either make the system better or make themselves stand out more in the market, which means that you have marketing going up and a lot of print media out there that's discussing, you know, oh, this is the disadvantages of the direct gas impingement, extolling the values of external gas piston and all that kind of stuff. Well, finally, the military, again, had to take notice of this because there was just this constant fervor that was building around external gas piston. And the United States Army conducted the individual carbine trials starting in 2010, where they put out a call for any new advancements in weapon systems to go ahead and be submitted, as long as they met specific requirements set up by the Army, in order to be able to see if anything was truly better than the M4 carbine. Now, it'd been quite a while since the M4 had been modified, probably close to 20 years, so it was not outside of the realm of possibility that there was some sort of technological advancement out on the market at that point that the Army was not taking advantage of. Well, in 2013, the Army ended the individual carbine program with the decision that there was nothing on the market that actually effectively replaced the M4 carbine, much to many people's chagrin. Now, let's go ahead and let's start talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the two systems. We'll start out with the disadvantage of the direct gas impingement system, which pretty much boils down to one thing. And the most common statement used to describe this is to say that the direct gas impingement system poops where it eats. And that is that when the hot gases and carbon come back into the receiver, they're getting sprayed into the bolt carrier group, which is the primary moving part of that system. You're introducing a lot of debris into the critical operating portions of the AR-15. You can see how this would be problematic for literally any type of machinery, let alone a weapon system that you're depending your life on. You could see where maybe that doesn't work out in logic. And that was the argument that was going up against the external gas piston. Now, in support of that argument, the external gas piston doesn't really transfer a lot of heat and debris to the bolt carrier group. You get a little bit of debris, and that's just from residual powder burn within the barrel that comes back onto the bolt carrier group. But if you compare the same number of rounds fired between the two systems, external gas piston is much cleaner on the bolt, keep in mind. The actual venting where it occurs against, where the gases actually act against the gas piston rod, that gets dirty. That's still something that has to be maintained. Now, again, to the support of the external gas piston system, the vast majority of those systems are adjustable. Now, a lot of them are just adjustable between suppressed or unsuppressed, but some do have settings in between, which would allow you to tune the gas system for how dirty it was. That's what it's supposed to be, for how dirty it is. Some rifles, specifically when you're getting the AR-10 platform, you're actually tuning for the performance of the .308 round because there's such a wide variance in pressures. But if you're talking about an AR-15, It's supposed to be that as the weapon gets more dirty, as you put hundreds and however many rounds it is that you're putting through, and it starts to get a little sluggish, you can open up that gas port a little bit more to get more reliable operation out of it. You can have this exact same thing in direct gas impingement, but it is far more ubiquitous on the external gas piston side of things. So it is a cooler, cleaner running system overall. You're at the very least not introducing a bunch of dirt to your bolt. Now, let's talk about the advantages of direct gas impingement by talking about some of the negatives of external gas piston, of which there's unfortunately no shortage. Now, external gas piston is generally going to be heavier, and this is a very difficult thing to avoid because you have additional moving parts, additional functioning parts that are added to the weapon system in order to be able to make it do what it does. You don't necessarily find those same heavier parts in a direct gas impingement system. Now, that's not to say that every external gas piston is obtrusively heavy. You can find plenty of rifle systems that will still be in an appropriate weight range for you. You just have to make that very individualized call. How I think about weights in AR-15 systems that I am viewing for purchase is that if I see weights that are more in common with an external gas piston on a direct gas impingement gun, I am less interested in it. Doesn't mean I'm against it, because it's still a question of, is the weight actually a hindrance in this case? But it doesn't really help it out either. However, if I see an external gas piston that has a naked weight that's running closer to what I would expect out of a direct gas impingement system, now I have interest there. That is something that would drive me towards a specific external gas piston setup. That's, kind of use that to guide your decisions if that's something that you think is important to you. Some people don't care about weight. I, over the years, have gotten more and more interested in having a lighter weight gun. Now, branching off of weight, we come down to cost. External gas piston guns in general are going to be more expensive. And that's because you have a whole bunch of additional parts, you have a lot of proprietary parts, and that means that there's more startup costs for the individual manufacturer. Now, let's go ahead and put this into context. I think the consistently lowest price point I've seen on external gas piston guns is somewhere around $900. Now, you could point out that an AR-556 or a MP-15 MSRPs for right around $900, so there's really not that big of a difference. However, that external gas piston gun is discounted, whereas you shouldn't be paying MSRP for a Ruger AR-556. I picked up mine for $500. Admittedly, a couple years ago, and in the current environment, that may not necessarily be true, but I would not expect to be paying MSRP for any of the budget-minded AR-15s. So you can start to see where this dynamic is not really lining up. The vast majority of your external gas piston systems are running over $1,000 and only continue to go up. You can find them flirting that line with $1,000, but for the most part, it's just going up. So now your response to that might be, well, fine, I'll just build my own. And that's a little more tricky in the external gas piston system because, once again, it runs on a lot of proprietary parts. You have to get the parts pretty much from the manufacturer. At that point, you might as well buy a rifle. Or you can build out a lower and then slap a manufacturer's upper on it from an external gas piston manufacturer. You can go ahead and slap that on there, and then you have a built external gas piston gun. But that, to me, looks a lot more like parts assembly than actual building, which, admittedly, really any AR-15 building is kind of just parts assembly, unless you're milling out polymer 80s or 80% lowers or whatever. That's really the only time you're actually building in the strictest of sense. And I know I'm kind of splitting hairs on that. I'm not trying to point fingers or tell you that you're not like a builder. You're whatever it is that you want to be. But that kind of looks more like parts assembly. Anyway, enough about that. Now, when it comes down to parts breakage or wanting to change out parts on your external piston gun, that is not as easy to do. Now, of course, they have plenty of parts that work with all the other direct gas impingement guns, your lower receiver and all that kind of stuff, unless it's something specific to the manufacturer, is going to be able to have any of the other AR-15 drop-in parts. It's handguards that really become the issue. And then also, the bolts do have to be built in a specific manner to be able to interact with the external gas piston system. So if you have any breakage that is specific to those proprietary parts, you have to go to the manufacturer. And you have to hope that A, the manufacturer is still in business, or B, they still produce parts for that rifle. When it comes to wanting to swap out rail sections and stuff like that, that's like where all the proprietary is located, is in the rails. So you may not necessarily, if you bought a key mod gun and you want an M-LOK, you may not, unless the manufacturer offers it, you may not be able to just switch that out. That's something to take into consideration when you're looking at external gas piston guns. Now the last thing, and this is going to require a lot of context, so stick with me here, is that external gas piston guns are generally less accurate. Now, a lot of people would make that statement, leave it there, maybe give out a couple examples of external gas piston guns being less accurate and then leave it alone. That's not the case. There are plenty of external gas piston guns that shoot sub-MOA. 100%. I'm there with you. You probably have a setup that does it. I'm sure I have setups that do it. Regardless, what the reality of the matter is that the external gas piston system has a more disruptive recoil impulse than direct gas impingement. Now, hold on here, stick with me. Direct gas impingement, when you look at overall reciprocating parts and all that kind of stuff, the vast majority of direct gas impingement's reciprocating parts start and operate very close to the balance point of the rifle. This is very key. And they are also traveling an overall shorter distance. Now, you can change up that disruptive dynamic based off of what the gas system is, carbine length versus rifle length. That is two very different recoil impulses, but they're not that difficult to manage. Now, when you talk about external gas piston recoil, you have to consider that all the moving parts pretty much stretch the entire length of the gun. You have somewhere out over the barrel where the movement starts, with the gases compressing the springs and the piston rod moving and all that kind of stuff. You probably have more than one piston rod, like segmented piston rod working inside of there as well, which then comes back, strikes the bolt, sends it back against the buffer spring. You just had literally this ripple effect move all the way down the rifle. That is going to disturb your sight picture. Now, if you're applying proper fundamentals and all that kind of stuff, it's not a big deal. You get kind of pushed off of your aiming point, you bring back on and apply your firing fundamentals, you get back on. You know, shoot that super tight shot grouping. All I'm saying is that if you feel rushed in that regard, you may not get as tight of a shot grouping than if you felt rushed with direct gas impingement. It's going to take you just fractions of a second more to get back on target, which gives you more opportunity to shank a shot and blow your group. That's all I'm saying there. Now, you'll see that same kind of thing if you're doing any type of shoot and move type stuff where you are trying to incorporate your body mechanics with your shooting fundamentals and then the management of recoil. Trying to find that firing cadence as you move might be a little more disruptive, might take you fractions of a second longer to get back on target with an external gas piston system. It's not something that can't be overcome. It's not something that can't be out-trained. It's just something that you might have to. You may initially notice a little bit wider groupings with external gas piston guns than you would see in a comparable direct gas impingement gun. That's all I'm saying there. That's the context of the conversation overall. Disruptive recoil impulse. It's really not a big issue, but it is something that you need to take into account. Now, let's talk about some advantages of the external gas piston system. And at this point, we've pretty much been talking about like 16-inch guns and longer, maybe down to 14.5. That's what I've primarily been talking about now. But where the external gas piston really begins to shine is when you start to talk about NFA type items. So short barrels, suppressors, and full automatic fire. This is where external gas piston really starts to come into play. Now, short barrels. So when you shorten a barrel, you change a lot of dynamics of a weapon system. You change pressurization, you change dwell time, and you also change a lot of timing issues that tie into those things. So take a Mark 18 with a 10.3-inch barrel, for example. It's already known that that has a wider gas port, which is supposed to give it more reliable function in dirty conditions. Austere environments, you might say. However, that also means that there is a lot more gas pressure coming back in the system, which means that the bolt and all the other reciprocating parts are moving much more violently, which means a couple of things when it comes to durability of the system. We're now putting more tension on our locking lugs. We're messing more with our bolts and all that kind of stuff to where we're potentially damaging the system with long-term use. that is something to be concerned about. The United States military, with its vast ability to be able to address malfunctions and breakages in weapons, decided that the reliability aspect was more important. For you, it may not necessarily be the same. This is where an external gas piston system does have a little bit of a leg up, especially when it comes down to the dwell time specifically. So when a brass-cased bullet is fired, that brass casing expands because of the heat and pressure within the system. Now, once that pressure drops below a certain point, that brass is going to contract, which then aids in easier extraction. You're working against less friction and all that kind of stuff, which means that you're not putting as much wear and tear on your operating parts, locking lugs, extractors, all that kind of stuff. However, when you diminish the dwell time, you change that dynamic to where now you're attempting to perform extraction with that casing potentially still expanded, which means that you're going to put more wear and tear on the gun overall. The external gas piston system is a little more forgiving in that respect. It's not 100% more forgiving. It's still an issue, but it's more forgiving in that respect. Now, suppressors exacerbate the situation because you're putting more pressure back into the system. Now, what is specific to suppressors is that they're often referred to as being very gassy. So with that, with gases being shot back into the system and all that kind of stuff, based on how suppressors work, you wind up with a lot of gas blowing out of the ejection port, as well as on an AR-15 coming down the charging handle directly into the shooter's face. Now, for the most part, this probably just going to result in watering eyes. However, there is a risk of perhaps debris coming along with it, so you do want to wear eye protection in that regard. If you're using it in a home or self-defense type situation, you may not have figured iPro in. I don't know. It's not really a concern for myself because I don't presently own any suppressors. Hoping to fix that, but haven't gotten around to it yet. But it might be something you want to consider if you're running a direct gas impingement AR-15 in a home defense type setting. Now, in addition to that, there are a lot of things out on the market that have been built to address this issue. Gas busting charging handles, you can get bolt carrier groups that will redirect that gas flow out of the ejection port and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of options out there. Just keep in mind that it might be something that you want to look into if you're planning to run a suppressed direct gas impingement system. Now, obviously, it's not that big of an issue because direct gas impingement is widely popular in a bunch of different suppressed pistol and SBR type formats. But if you're looking to build kind of that unbeatable reliability, that might be something that you want to look into. And then full automatic fire. By the external gas piston system putting less heat specifically into the bolt carrier group, you save that from a lot of potential wear or premature damage. Especially once metal heats up, it gets more malleable. When you then add in a lot of very rapid movement, potentially also on a short barrel. So now we're really starting to play with that dynamic of how much tension are we putting on, I don't know, locking lugs or something like that. You have an increased risk of damage to those parts. External gas piston system takes care of that by removing the heat from that operating section. And you see this with the Marine Corps' move to the M27 IAR, which is their replacement for the squad automatic weapon. So, those three things may not necessarily apply to the average shooter. People most definitely own 16-inch guns probably before they own AR pistols. However, if you're looking at getting into that kind of thing and you want just the most bulletproof setup, you might look at external gas piston. Now, my own experience between the two systems, I have thousands of rounds through AR-15s in general. And I can remember one specific instance, actually like 10 years ago, where I took a M4 carbine to a class and I ran well over 1,000 rounds through it. But I remember specifically that in 1,000 rounds, I had a single stoppage. And that stoppage was actually able to be corrected with immediate action. I did not have to diagnose the failure or anything like that. My immediate action process took care of the malfunction and had me right back on target in 1,000 rounds. I think it's kind of difficult to ask for more than that. And in that class, we didn't have time to clean. There was no time to strip apart the weapon system and actually get in there and clean off all that carbon. Best you could do was wipe it down with a rag and put a little bit of CLP on it before you'd lose something in the grass trying to take apart the bolt carrier group. So it was being run real dirty. And I only had one malfunction in 1,000 rounds. That's pretty good. Now, I will go so far as to say that when it comes to external gas piston guns, of which I own a couple, I've only ever had malfunctions related to ammunition. And that was specifically steel-cased ammunition, to which it seems that external gas piston doesn't really like steel-cased ammunition. But that may or may not be an issue to you. The majority of malfunctions I have in direct gas impingement guns can almost directly be blamed on magazines. So I honestly, if you were to ask my overall opinion, I would honestly tell you that I don't think it matters. You have to decide for yourself, be realistic with yourself about how many rounds you're actually going to be running through the system without cleaning, and what it is that's going to better suit your needs. Like, I completely understand wanting to build something to be just, go to hell capable. Extremely reliable, 100% hardened against breaking itself, and all that kind of stuff. I completely understand that. I've built out guns for that exact same purpose as well. But if you don't have the money for it, you're not wrong to take a good hard look at direct gas impingement systems. You can achieve the same thing in direct gas impingement systems as long as you're being savvy about the parts that you're selecting. So I would not necessarily say one's better than the other, as much as I would say that it's a very individualized process to decide which one actually applies to your purposes. All right, guys. Well, with that being the case, that's pretty much what I got. I hope you found this helpful, and have a good day.